On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The man arrested for his murder was Lee Harvey Oswald. But before Oswald could be tried, he also fell victim to an assassin's bullet. And so there never was a trial for the crime of the century. Until now. Showtime presents On Trial, Lee Harvey Oswald.
I really don't know what the situation is about. Nobody has told me anything except that I'm accused of murdering a policeman. I know nothing more than that, and I do request someone to come forward to give me a legal assistance.
Hello, I'm Edwin Newman. Welcome back to the conclusion of Showtime's presentation of On Trial, Lee Harvey Oswald. Coming up shortly, Oswald, for the first time ever, will have someone to give him legal assistance. Attorney Jerry Spence presents the case for the defense. He will be calling real witnesses, including an ex-FBI man who knew Oswald, an eyewitness on the grassy knoll, medical technician present at Kennedy's autopsy, a policeman who will possibly connect Jack Ruby with a conspiracy plot, and others. All of them as Jerry Spence tries to convince the jury that Oswald is innocent of assassinating President John F. Kennedy. In Part 1, we saw prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi present a detailed case against Oswald. His witnesses included the man who drove Oswald to work on the day of the assassination, when Oswald was carrying a rifle-length package, a co-worker who was standing just a few feet below the alleged sniper's nest, the policeman who first encountered Oswald in the lunchroom and who found in the Texas Book Depository the rifle that was later connected to Oswald. Another eyewitness identified Oswald as the killer of Officer Tippit, and there was the woman Oswald's wife lived with, a woman who had come to know Oswald well in the weeks before that fateful day in November, 23 years ago. With me now to watch the second half of the trial and to join me in a discussion later are Alan Dershowitz, an attorney and professor at the Harvard Law School, Ramsey Clark, an attorney, former Attorney General of the United States, and Jack Anderson, investigative journalist and syndicated columnist. Gentlemen, welcome. Let me remind you that at the end of the trial and before the jury returns its verdict, we will be conducting a live telephone poll to give you at home an opportunity to express your opinion on Oswald's guilt or innocence. We will tally your votes before the jury's verdict is revealed.
Defense rests.
Defense rests.
Thank you. At this time, we'll take a recess.
At this point, all the witnesses for the defense and prosecution have testified. It will now be up to Jerry Spence and Vincent Bugliosi to summarize the testimony and evidence in their closing statements. Before we hear these in just a minute or two, let's get a quick reaction from our guests. Alan Dershowitz, what should we be looking for in these closing statements in the way of style, in the way of tactics?
Well, the first rule of closing statements is that the lawyer who has the facts on his side bangs in the facts. The lawyer who has the law on his side bangs in the law. The lawyer who has neither on his side bangs on the table. Mr. Bugliosi has a lot of facts on his side, and he's going to emphasize the facts that are available. Mr. Spence, on the other hand, should emphasize the missing facts. Was there a cover-up? Was evidence tampered with? He's not going to try to focus the jury on whether Oswald did it, but how can you convict somebody if there are missing facts? But he can't go too far because Bugliosi has the last word. He has to try to anticipate Bugliosi's closing summation and try to deflect it as much as possible.
Ramsey Clark, what will Bugliosi and Spence try to do in their closing statements that they have not been able to do in their examination of witnesses?
These are two superb trial lawyers, and each is obviously very anxious to persuade that jury. Mr. Bugliosi will come on in his first shot. He has two chances. I think in rapid machine gun fire summarizing the evidence, he has a lot of facts his way, and I think he'll really pour it on and try and nail down some loose ends. Mr. Spence will come on, first trying to make the jury lean over backwards his way, because he'll say, you know, we've all been prejudiced about this. We've been told all of our lives that Lee Harvey Oswald did this. You've got to be fair. Then he wants to lean on the emotion we all have, the profound doubt we all had. It's what really happened. He's got to create a reasonable doubt, and he can't go too far. If he gets in a position where he can be accused when Mr. Bugliosi comes back of involving the FBI, involving the CIA, he'll be wiped out. Mr. Bugliosi has to watch how he does, because when he comes back, he has the last chance to persuade the jury his way.
Jack Anderson, your comment.
Well, the opposing attorneys are going to go after a stark, terse verdict, guilty or not guilty. I'd feel better if there were another alternative, and I think that there is one, and that's the possibility that Oswald may be guilty, but he may have been part of a conspiracy.
That, of course, is not something the jury can say, or is it?
No, I don't think that the jury can say that, and I don't think the two attorneys can go after that, but this is a distinct possibility. There's evidence, I think, already introduced. And
there, I must
interrupt
interrupt you, Jack. We'll be hearing more from you later. At this point, let's rejoin the trial for the final summations.
Members of the jury, we are now going to have final summations or final arguments by the attorneys.
Normally, ladies and gentlemen, in a murder case, a verdict of guilty brings about a certain measure of justice, obviously a limited amount of justice, but a certain measure of justice for the victim and his or her surviving loved ones. But here, the effect of this assassination went far beyond President Kennedy and his family. This was an enormous offense against the American people, and no justice could ever be achieved. I respectfully ask you to return a swift verdict of guilty against Lee Harvey Oswald, simply because it is the only verdict that is consistent with the evidence, evidence which conclusively proves Oswald's guilt beyond all reasonable doubt. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Bugliosi. Mr. Spence, you may proceed, sir.
Thank you. And so, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I give you and place into your hands the history of this country and the case of Lee Harvey Oswald. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spence. Mr. Bugliosi, you may proceed, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, defense counsel, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, based on the evidence in this case, Lee Harvey Oswald is as guilty as sin, and there's nothing that Mr. Spence can do about it. As surely as I am standing here, as surely as night follows day, Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, is responsible for the murder of President John F. Kennedy. You are 12 reasonable men and women, and that is why I have every confidence that you will confirm this fact for the pages of history by your verdict of guilty. Thank you so very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Members of the jury, now that you've heard all of the evidence in the case, as well as the final arguments and summations by the lawyers, it becomes my duty to instruct you on the rules of law that you must follow in arriving at your decision in this case.
Court will stand in recess, awaiting the jury's determination.
So, as the jury files out, Showtime's trial draws to a close. We will be revealing their verdict in just a few minutes. Before we do, we're going to conduct a telephone poll to give you at home a chance to register your own opinion on Oswald's guilt or innocence. Here's how to do it. If you think that the prosecution has proven Oswald to be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, then dial 1-900-720-6881. If you are not convinced of Oswald's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, then dial 1-900-720-6882 to register a not guilty vote. That's 1-900-720-6881 for guilty, 1-900-720-6882 for not guilty. While we wait for your votes to come in and be counted, let's get some reactions to the trial from our guest tonight. Jack Anderson, I cut you off earlier when you were saying you wish there were an alternative to guilty or not guilty. Why did you say that?
Well, after that dreadful day in Dallas, Ed, I began digging into the murky subterranean world of the Central Intelligence Agency. I found that the CIA had recruited mafia killers to knock off Fidel Castro. They made 8 attempts on Castro's life. The last of them occurred in March 1963. On September 7th, 1963, Castro, in a 3-hour interview with Daniel Harker of the Associated Press, said he had found out about these attempts and that he was aware that the CIA was trying to kill Cuban leaders. And he warned that 2 could play at that game. And he said that if Cuban leaders were going to be shot at, that American leaders would also not be safe. It was exactly 3 months after that, or a little over 3 months after that, that John Kennedy was gunned down in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald, and we've had plenty of testimony showing his links to the Castro movement.
Any comment on that from you, Ramsey Clark?
Well, it seems to me that we've had the most comprehensive investigation in history, probably, of any single episode or series of events. I think the Warren Commission under Chief Justice Earl Warren, under very difficult circumstances, did a marvelous job. The real challenge to us today is to remember we lost a great young president. How, in the face of that, do we keep our idealism? How do we continue to march on the new frontier toward the elimination of poverty, toward peace, toward equal justice here in America? If we torment ourselves about the assassination, if we permit the CIA to come back now with perhaps disinformation rather than disgorging the truth and say Castro did it or something like that, we're not looking to the future. We have to prevent this from happening again, but we have to be able to face it when it happens and not succumb to chaos and to irrationality and to violence.
Alan Dershowitz?
What I think we have to prevent from happening in the future, as well as assassination, is compromising the integrity of the fact-finding process. What happened here is that evidence was deliberately destroyed by the government, that a cover-up was engaged in. People may argue that the evidence that was destroyed was not central, but we have to take that on faith. We know the government destroyed evidence. We know that J. Edgar Hoover made a decision that the facts should not come out about the role of the FBI. And once the process has been interfered with, you can't ask the American people to accept as facts, even if the facts, whatever we have left of them, point in one direction. And I think there's been a healthy aspect to this, too. I think the myth of government infallibility, the myth of government honesty under all circumstances, has been forever exposed. The American people are doubting Thomases. That's probably a good thing, but we have to turn our attention to how to restore faith in the integrity of the fact-finding process after this investigation.
Well, Ed, I didn't mean to tromp on the ideological toes of Ramsey Clark, but I can tell you that this CIA angle is not something new. It's not disinformation just coming out. It may be disinformation, I don't know. It is information that came out at the time. You see, the very first person that came to Robert Kennedy's, who saw Robert Kennedy immediately after the assassination was John McCone, the head of the CIA. Spent 3 hours with Robert Kennedy. Nobody else was admitted during that briefing, not even Robert Kennedy's priest. And the next day, John McCone gave a similar briefing, apparently, to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson came out after the briefing, said to intimates, said afterward to intimates, that he was worried that Castro may have been involved.
Jack, as you know, I worked the next 10 months with Bob Kennedy in the Department of Justice, and he had no doubt about whether the FBI or the CIA had been involved or done anything wrong or were involved in a cover-up. I worked the next 5 years with Lyndon Johnson, and in my judgment, he didn't either. We had a very thorough investigation. I think we know pretty much what the facts are. Sure, we can keep we can keep examining and looking, but it's been 23 years, and the idea that there's any major big conspiracy behind Lee Harvey Oswald, who had the clear capacity and will to do it alone, is pretty remote.
Ramsey, I find myself in the unusual position of agreeing with you on your conclusion. I personally believe that he did it and that he probably did it alone. And I believe that you believe that because you've had access to important inside information. But how do you persuade a doubting American public who knows two things? One, that evidence was deliberately destroyed in order to suppress the whole truth. And two, that the remaining evidence seems to point logically to your conclusion. How do you ask them to accept on faith a conclusion which you know to be true, but in which the process and the integrity has been so distorted that an honest American not accessible to your information could have reasonable doubts?
Well, Alan, you seem to have some notion that, that investigative agencies don't generally do that. You ought to read the newspaper every day, and you'd realize that that goes on constantly. The FBI was protecting itself. It shouldn't have done it. There are really only two ways you're ever going to get what you're seeking, which is highly desirable. One is to abolish all covert actions. I happen to favor that. We shouldn't have covert actions. And the other is to change human nature, and that's, we haven't found the
Well,
formula.
I have a third suggestion. It seems to me that when a case comes to trial and the integrity of the process has been interfered with, the jury should not vote to convict, even if the facts point to the direction the government wants them to point to. And if I had been Jerry Spence, I would not have focused as much on the end result, the truth, because the truth, I think, was not on his side. I would have tried to persuade the jury that even if you believe on the basis of the evidence that's available that Oswald is probably guilty and probably guilty alone, you should still not vote to convict because you have not been given access to all the evidence. The process was tampered with, and the process is what we have faith in. You know, the Soviet Union, when they tell us that somebody is guilty, we don't believe it. We don't believe it because the process doesn't work there. In our country, it mostly works. Sometimes there's an interference with the process, but it mostly works. And if I had been the defense lawyer in this case, I would have focused more on process and less on results.
Well, Mr. Spence, began with the story about the closed closet, and he ended with the story about the closed closet, and that's exactly what he was talking about. But the idea that you couldn't have a conviction if there was any evidence set aside or fiddled with by the government would preclude any convictions in any case, because it happens every time.
Well, Jack Anderson in Washington, go ahead.
I think the evidence is, of course, overwhelming that Lee Harvey Oswald was the killer. But there's some evidence that hasn't come out. There are a couple of things that trouble me. And I believe that if there's any way to get to the bottom of it, that much as I'd like to sweep this away, make this a Showtime trial the final answer, there are still questions that I'd like to get answers to. For example, Johnny Roselli, one of the mafia killers, told me, I gained his confidence, he told me that Castro was involved. And he gave me some of the details, which I won't take the time to talk about now. And I can tell you that he was killed for having told me this. He was executed.
He was killed by whom, Jack?
He was killed, according to the New York Times, by Santos Traficante and his people down there in Florida.
Well, what was the connection then between that and
Santos Traficante was involved in the Castro affair. Santos Traficante and Sam Giancano and Johnny Roselli were the three the capos who set it up. And Johnny Roselli gave me this testimony. Also that there was also a police motorcycle that had its transmitter going, and it was recorded. And in 1963, it was just a lot of cacophony. But by 1978, computer sciences had advanced a little bit, and the House committee listened again to that recording and had it checked out and said that they were 95% sure that there was a fourth shot fired from the grassy knoll.
One of the most remarkable things about this case is that for the first time in history, a defense attorney whose job it was to show that Oswald didn't do it and didn't do it alone had an opportunity to cross-examine the witnesses that came to the other conclusion. That was never true during the Warren Commission report. It was never true during the House investigation. It really does show the advantage of the adversary system. And I think facts came out as a result of Spence's cross-examination at this trial that hadn't previously come out.
Ramsey Clark, your turn.
Well, I find it very hard to believe that facts came out that hadn't come out before. It's been 23 years now, and people have been conditioned for a long time to think what they think. And clearly the best way to find facts is not by cross-examination on a witness stand, it's by having 150 investigators out there with microscopes and anything else looking for them.
I don't believe that. Not if they're all committed to one version of the truth. And there's nobody whose job it is to show in an adversary process that they may be wrong. The adversary process really does work.
And J. Edgar Hoover himself said that he was under pressure to finger Lee Harvey Oswald and to pin the guilt on him. He made a public statement to that effect.
You know, patriotism and truth sometimes push in opposite directions. It may very well have been in the patriotic interest of this country to establish a certain kind of truth, and yet the truth may lie elsewhere. But even if it doesn't lie elsewhere, the process is what's important, because that's what the future looks to.
May I raise one point here, perhaps in closing? Is there significant evidence that has not yet been revealed? And if there is, why has it not yet been revealed? Ramsey Clark, you?
Well, I don't think there is. There's some evidence that the public hasn't seen. For instance, the X-rays and autopsy photos, because of a decision I made, aren't available to the public. Experts, radiologists, and others can see them, but Mrs. Kennedy didn't want them spread on the front page of a magazine someplace during the life of her children, and I thought that was reasonable and humane, and that was the decision I made.
The one thing we should know is exactly what evidence is not available. We've never even seen a complete catalog of the evidence that isn't available. So we even have to take that on faith. What is not available, what was destroyed, what will become available then. You can't accept truth on the basis of faith.
Jack Anderson, last comment from you.
No question that there are facts that haven't yet been spread on the record, that there are facts that need to be examined. I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of this. I wish again that it were possible, but I don't think it will be, and I think that a question mark is going to continue to hang over the John F. Kennedy assassination.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now let's hear what the two attorneys themselves thought of the trial.
I think it's definitely going to become a historical document in the sense that heretofore there has not been any cross-examination of the people who testified before the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations.
The Warren Commission reports are just reports. They're just words. What a trial does for the search of truth that a written record doesn't is the difference between seeing live, real people and reading a dead, meaningless record.
There were witnesses, for instance, who said they thought they saw someone running from the grassy knoll. And that's become a part of the historical record. It's in the House Select Committee on Assassinations. But anyone who watches the TV show and reads the transcript, that particular witness, a nice fellow, but he did not stand up on cross-examination at all. It's obvious that he didn't know what he was talking about. I mean, he thought that was Jack Ruby running away from the scene of the crime. And the majority of the American people now believe, right now, polls have shown that there was a conspiracy in this case. And the reason for that is that the side of the government has never been presented. It's been presented, it's in the Warren Report, but that's 27 volumes. Who's gone out and purchased 27 volumes? They haven't done that. The only books that have come out on this case are by conspiracy buffs, and these are the people that have gone on talk shows throughout the country, and they finally convinced the American people. So the importance of this case is that we finally now gave the American people and the people around the world the prosecution's viewpoint.
In the very broad sense, there isn't any winner or maybe loser in this case. You know, Vince Bugliosi and I talked about that last night. We're both proud lawyers, and we both want to win. Right now, as I talk to you, the jury is deliberating. And I said to Vince, you know, it doesn't really make any difference whether you win or I win, Vince, because what we have really done is to present a piece of reality and history with the real witnesses in a real trial between two real lawyers who really cared about their case, so that the American public can, for the first time, get a glimpse of the truth. And when two people do that, they're both winners.
The results of our telephone poll have now been tallied, so let's see how you voted in the Eastern and Central time zones. Now, what we find is that The vote for guilty beyond a reasonable doubt was 15%. I will repeat that, 15%. And the vote for not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, 85%. I have to say, I'm astonished by that outcome. I truly am. If it had gone the other way, 85% for guilty, 15% for not guilty, I think that would have been more in line with what those of us associated with this program generally expected. It's an extraordinary verdict. 85% voting that in this trial, at any rate, Lee Harvey Oswald had not been proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. 85% voting for not guilty. Now, please do bear in mind, in comparing these results with the jury's verdict, which you will shortly hear, that the jury has seen more complete testimony, has had more detailed instructions from the judge, and of course has had a lot more time sequestered in a room to review the trial transcript and evidence. Now, the moment we've been waiting for is here. Until now, only the producers of this program and the jurors themselves knew how they voted. As the jury files back in, it's time finally for you and me to find out their verdict.
Please rise.
You may be seated. I have a note here which reads as follows. Your Honor, we have reached a unanimous verdict dated November 22, 1986, signed Jack Morgan, foreperson. Mr. Morgan, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
If you would, please, if you'd just hand it to the marshal. You may be seated. All right, fine. Counsel, if you would, please, if you'd please stand. I'll ask Mr. Nelson, if he would, to please read the verdict.
Verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant Lee Harvey Oswald guilty of the offense charged in 1 of the indictment.
Bit of clarification here. That reference to 1 of the indictment was a reference to count 1, which was indeed the only count in the indictment. It was a charge of premeditated murder, murder in the first degree. So, to repeat, the jury's verdict, unanimous verdict, was guilty. Now, because the lingering controversy about this case has revolved around the issue of a conspiracy, having declared Oswald guilty, the jury was instructed to reconvene to consider, for the sake of history, whether they felt Oswald had acted alone or with others. And the majority concluded that he was the sole assassin. 7 voted that he was the sole assassin. 3 voted for a conspiracy. 2 were undecided. Now, you'll notice 3 voted and said they believed there was a conspiracy, which must have meant that they thought Oswald was part of that conspiracy, because the vote to convict him on the charge of murder was unanimous. 7 voted that he was a sole assassin, 3 voted conspiracy, 2 voted undecided. We have an extraordinary situation here in which the jury reached a verdict of guilty, and our viewers, by 85% to 15%, felt that he had not been found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So we've reached the end of on trial Lee Harvey Oswald, and I have just heard for the first time, as you did, the verdict of guilty, and the majority view that he acted alone. Now, As this program went on, I scribbled some notes. I scribbled them also as someone who took part in covering the original story, and I anticipated to some extent my own reaction to the verdict. The first question, I suppose, is whether the verdict will allay all doubts and put this matter to rest, and I think that would be too much to expect. Probably it will never happen. The verdict in itself does materially strengthen support for the findings of the Warren Commission, and perhaps it removes some of the feelings of desperate dissatisfaction and sadness that must accompany the murder of a president, even more a murder that is not technically solved. But then again, as we were saying earlier, we do have a verdict by the viewers of this program that's absolutely opposite to that arrived at by the jury. Viewers of this program voting in a telephone poll, so far at any rate, have voted 85% to 15% that Oswald was not proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That was in the eastern and central time zones of the United States. On this point, we heard Ramsey Clark and Alan Dershowitz disagree about the possible value of evidence still held by the government. If there is any such evidence that could conceivably shed some light on what happened on November 22nd, 1963, clearly it should be made public. A final reflection, we do have in this country from time to time grim chapters in our history. The killing of President Kennedy gave rise to such a chapter. It has a peculiar power to go on troubling us, almost to haunt us. Did this program clear the air and define the issues? Well, given the difference between the jury verdict and the viewer's verdict, perhaps it did not clear the air. But at any rate, we think it did help to define the issues. If it did do that, we accomplished at any rate part of what we set out to do. I'm Edwin Newman. Thank you and good night.